What you see is what you get. It's a phrase that we've probably heard and probably from time to time mentioned ourselves. In the verses that I read from the prophet Isaiah, we find the idea that God hopes that the world gets what it sees. As our confirmation class knows from our walking through talking about some of the prophets and having some fun actually putting them in chronological order rather than in the order that we find them here. Much of the Hebrew Testament, and especially the prophets, is built around this truth that God has established a precious covenant with God's people. Covenant, relationship. And these prophets, time and time again, come back to tell the people, to warn the people, to say, things are getting a little off track. We're wandering away from what those promises are that we make and that we keep for this covenant relationship with God. And if we don't keep our end of the bargain, God tells us there could be some serious consequences. While the relationship with God is certainly unique, like none other, not a relationship of equals, we do draw on the fact that relationship is relationship. And it calls us to ask ourselves, what might happen, or what has happened in our own lives if we neglect the relationship? Or even more to the point, if we say or do things with thoughtlessness or with intention that are hurtful to those very relationships. In the case with God's people, those breaches often, Scripture tells us, led to exile. And in these last chapters from Isaiah, this is the point where the people are coming home. They're being restored to the land. But Isaiah is realizing the writing is on the wall again. We've gotten what we wanted. We've come back home. The exile is over. But we're falling off the tracks. Taking the covenant relationship for granted, the people are losing their focus, losing their way, losing sight of what's most important in that relationship with God. The priorities have gotten as cloudy as today's weather was. They're back to neglecting the poor among them. Perhaps they're keeping all the rituals that the law has told them to keep, but they're doing it with kind of the pageantry of a royal coronation, but their actions betray them. Maybe they claim to keep faithful, but it's kind of become a grand show. Maybe they fast, but fasting doesn't mean much if it only means skipping a meal. What this passage tells us is that fasting has meaning when it's done sacrificially. Actually, what comes to mind for me is that we had that really good ice cream yesterday in session. And I could fast from that ice cream, only to come back to it later. But what Isaiah is saying is true fasting means rather than leave it in that freezer until the time where I say, okay, I can have it again. If instead I say, no, I want you to have that ice cream. I want to share and give sacrificially rather than just store up and wait for a time period for myself. Our Lenten season is like that. We can say all the right things. We can sing all the right hymns. Conveniently, the hymnals all tend to give us like the Lenten section of choices. We could practice all the right rituals. But we can do those things and still miss the reflective focus of Lent. It's both spiritual and practical. There's tangible things that we can do. Share bread with the hungry. Open the door of shelter to someone who has nowhere else to turn. Cover the ones who are exposed to the elements. Because these are family of us, because they're family of God. If we're serious about Lent, if we're serious about God, then we hear Isaiah's words speak to us. Centuries, millennia later. Look and listen around us this Lent. When we stand up for justice or fairness or respect or dignity, we're responding to these words and these verses. We're responding to God's call to be in relationship with one another and be in relationship with God. To fast is to intentionally be mindful about being humble, about caring about what matters. And it's personal and it's broader, it's social. God decided, out of a place of love, to send Jesus Christ into this world, to take on the same form that you and I have. That's personal. Scripture tells us time and time again, from the beginnings of the law, through the prophets, and certainly through the Gospels, that we are called to look out for the vulnerable. That's social. Personal and social together. And what does Isaiah tell us will happen when we do that? He says, the gloomiest of our gloomy times will be as bright as the sunshine, as bright as noonday. When we purposely, intentionally, sacrificially take care of one another, Isaiah tells us God will take care of us. It's not about storing up for ourselves. It's about realizing whatever we have, God has given us and charged us to share it. And when we do that, God promises we will be fruitful gardens. We'll have healthy bodies. We'll have hopeful generations after us. After I've gone from ashes to ashes, generations from now, we'll have hope. Our cities will be restored. All those promises are there. What you see is what you get. Let's see ourselves do what God calls us to do, confident in the promises that God gives us in relationship.